All right, so now that we've talked about the basic elements of habitat, let's talk about how animals on rangeland actually interact with each other. And we're going to specifically talk about our livestock domestic grazers and our wildlife species. So, interactions can either between animals can actually or can either be positive or negative. And we as rangeland managers have to spend quite a bit of time managing for those positive or negative interactions. So, those interactions can depend on a variety of things, whether the animal actually has any young that they're caring for, like a calf or a fawn or whatever. It is going to depend on how much feed is available, what season it is. It's also going to depend on how many animals are within their herding species. And it can also, it's going to also depend on terrain, so topography, all of that good stuff as well. So there's 1,000 different things that a positive or negative interaction can actually result from. So, some positive impacts that we aim to manage for as rangeland managers is appropriate water quality. So, poor water quality is has many negative implications for us as humans, recreationists, as well as animal species and and plant species as well. So if you think about a stock pond that is very, very cloudy and has lots of silt in it and may even have some toxins, some runoff, that type of thing, that whole system or that whole stock pond is very unhealthy. And unfortunately, it's not contained just to itself. It's going to serve as a watering source for domestic grazers as well as wildlife. The surrounding vegetation is going to use a lot of that water for its own growth cycle, and we're going to see seepage in those stock ponds into the lower um, water basin. So if it doesn't get completely rid of toxins and stuff, we can actually spread toxins through entire water basins. So water quality management is a very, very big deal on rangeland all throughout the U.S. And we talk about it in California very frequently because we have so many riparian areas or flowing water areas as well. So, other positive impacts could be the relationship between improving forage on rangeland for wildlife and domestic grazers. So, even though a rancher is trying to improve forage by managing for a reduced stocking rate, that is going to give his cattle greater quality forage. That's also going to create greater quality forage for wildlife species as well. And then maintaining habitat and cover for wildlife species can actually be done by using domestic grazers too. So all of these things can help increase wildlife populations. Some additional positive impacts, more specific to water quality, that we deal with here in California quite a bit are riparian and meadow communities. And so these temperate zones are very, very fragile ecosystems that provide available drinking water to wildlife species and high quality forages that you're not going to find in mountainous areas. So, for example, in the Lhasa National Forest, there's all of these little mountain meadows that have the potential to have really good forage quality and be a reservoir for water for wildlife and domestic species. However, we cannot overpopulate that area with domestic grazers because our domestic grazers graze much differently than our wildlife species. So they're going to want to be down in those valleys much more frequently than our wildlife species. So they could actually damage the water quality just from a simple choice to be in an area that's a little easier to graze compared to in the mountain areas. So this is why we manage for stocking rate. So we manage for light to moderate grazing rather than heavy grazing. So some additional positive impacts on the forage quality side would be by increasing forage quality for our grazing species, we would also be increasing that quality for small mammals and upland game birds. So this is going to create more seeds that are rich in energy, more total vegetation that is going to result in not only sufficing diet needs but also protection needs in cover and in thermal and hiding cover. It's also going to help with biodiversity by creating more species that can actually survive in a certain area. So you'll see not only grasses in certain areas, but you'll see forbs and shrubs. And the more biodiversity you have, the more able that ecosystem is able to provide for as a feed source for wildlife and domestic species, but also to provide cushion when in terms of evolution or climatic factors, such as drought. So positive impacts are going to be multiple fold when we manage for forage quality. So with improved forage quality, we can also improve habitat. And so we can use our domestic grazers like cattle, sheep, and goats to actually create patchy mosaic patterns that are preferred by some of our feeding or some of our nesting bird species. So if we establish shrubs in a certain rangeland region, this is going to provide a habitat for some of those birds, even though the cattle don't necessarily use it. By making it a part of the ecosystem, we can actually bring biodiversity back to a rangeland region. All right, so some negative impacts really are, I'm not going to sugarcoat it, are related to improper grazing and overgrazing. So if we overgraze an area, even if it isn't intended, we are creating downstream effects like reducing nesting sites, decreasing the quality of the water in the area. If you have a lot of animals on one site, they can actually go through and trample some nesting sites that are important for waterfowl habitat. If you improperly graze and take all the vegetative matter from like one of those upland or mountain valleys that I was talking about a couple slides ago, then you actually change the migration pattern. So wildlife won't come to that area because there's no feed there. So they have no ability to hide from predators to get some really dense nutrition. They have to stay out in the mountain tree regions. And improper grazing actually has the ability to reduce the native fish populations as well. So especially if there's a lot of riparian areas in that area, having too many domestic grazers eating too much of the vegetation around those riparian areas will actually decrease the living conditions in the stream for some of those native fish populations. So one example of a negative impact is actually in the form of disease transmission. So this happened in late 2010, and it was a research study that was done by Washington State University, and they were surveying domestic sheep species that because they're domestic, they go through a series of vaccination protocols, and they're not really vaccinated for some of the diseases that the native wildlife species of sheep actually carry. So you can see, if we get an illness in a bighorn sheep population, and there's also domestic sheep grazing in that same area, you can get a zoonotic effect and get disease transmission very, very quickly. So, and you're going to see that happen in an area that is more densely populated with our domestic grazers than if they were dispersed out. So, properly managed grazing really comes down to a few key components. When we properly manage, we can create a very patchy habitat that And we can also create open, dense mosaic patterns of vegetation that our bird species really like. We can reduce the coarse grasses by simply grazing off those coarse grasses and create greater forage quality for our wildlife species. We can also stimulate the production of browse species by reducing grass biomass. So I'll show you some pictures later in class where we have certain mountain areas that are very, very densely populated with a very coarse grass species, and honestly, like, nothing else is going to be able to come up because that grass is so dense. So that area actually just really needs a good fire, hopefully a controlled fire, but it needs a good fire to kind of take out off that whole thatch area to get some more biodiversity to come up in that area. And we can also use, with properly managed grazing, we can use livestock to manage our weed populations and reduce fire risk. And then strategically, we can actually use our grazing species to create areas with bare ground, even though that's kind of a red flag. It's actually needed in some ecosystems. So this can be for feeding areas, dusting areas, or display areas. Irresponsible grazing, of course, has negative connotations with it, and we can see a variety of different things, but reducing nest sites is a big consideration in the Great Basin. And here in California, we worry a lot about reducing the floral diversity because we have so many forbs, and that attracting predators and parasites as well as diseases. So some of the effects that ranches have on wildlife are ranches comes developed water, fencing lines that can keep things in, but also keep other things out. Ranches in general create big, beautiful blocks of land that isn't going to be developed, so it creates a thoroughfare for our wildlife species, and a reduced area for that's could potentially have lots of disturbance. And you guys will see, I'm going to post some links to some sustainable ranching videos online as well. So grazing systems, strategically using grazing can do a couple of different things. They can actually create strategic rest for certain rangeland areas, and our ability to remove livestock or move livestock around strategically, we can actually open up areas for fawning during that time and reduce the total disturbance, so those fawns can actually stay and grow in one particular area. We can also have the ability to stock very heavy in pastures that have weedy patches and try to graze very heavily to get rid of some of those weeds. So here's two examples of some ranching and wildlife interaction or management interactions, and these are going to be posted on Blackboard as well.